The biting wind seemed to howl through the narrow mountain pass, carrying with it the cruel promise of an eternal winter. In the deep snow, a young boy pressed his back against a jagged rock, his breath forming thick white clouds in the frozen air. Beside him, a magnificent German shepherd stood guard, its thick fur dusted with frost, its intelligent eyes scanning the white wilderness. The boy looked down at his loyal companion, his voice a low whisper that carried the weight of their imaginary plight. He murmured to the dog, telling him that he did not know if they were going to make it out of this perilous situation, for they had been completely out of food for 3 long days. The temperature, he imagined, must be 50 below zero. He could almost feel the phantom eyes of the wild wolves watching them from the shadows of the snowdrifts, just waiting for a single chance to strike. But they only had one chance left, and they were going to have to fight their way out together. Suddenly, the harsh winter wilderness vanished, dissolving back into the warm, sunlit spaces of a comfortable suburban bedroom. The boy, whose name was Colin, looked up from his daydream as the door opened. His mother, Laura, stood in the doorway with a gentle but firm look on her face. She called out his name, telling him it was time to go, and that he needed to be ready right there. Colin stood up, dusting off his jeans, nodding as his mother reminded him that they had a schedule to keep. Downstairs, the great dog followed them, its tail wagging with a slow, rhythmic grace. Colin looked at the dog, then at his mother, begging her if they could please take the animal with them. Laura sighed and gave a familiar answer, stating that her husband had said no. Colin looked away, muttering under his breath that Joe was not his true father. Still, he knelt down to pat the heavy fur of the dog, whispering to him to stay here, to be a good boy, and promising that he would see him later. In the quiet house, a single note left on the counter seemed to sum up the cold reality of their domestic life. It was a brief message from Joe, stating that he would be home late and requesting that Mary feed the dog. When Joe finally arrived later that evening, the atmosphere was thick with tension. He walked out to the backyard, carrying a dish of food, his voice dripping with irritation as he looked at the animal, calling it a stupid mutt and asking if it was even going to eat. The darkness of the night seemed to swallow the yard, and a sudden, strange rustling sound broke the silence, changing the course of many lives in an instant. The next morning, the sun rose over a house surrounded by a quiet air of mystery. A tall, distinguished gentleman with kind eyes and a gray suit walked up the driveway. His name was Barnaby Jones, a seasoned investigator known for his sharp mind and gentle demeanor. He was greeted at the door by a sharp-eyed young woman named Claudia Elwood, who informed him that Laura was not home at the moment. Barnaby explained that his secretary had called the day before to arrange an appointment, and he suspected he might be a little early. Claudia invited him inside, explaining that she was a law partner of the late Mr. Beecher and had stopped by to collect some important papers he had been working on before his sudden passing. When Barnaby revealed that he represented the California Meridian Insurance Company, Claudia shifted her posture. Joe Beecher had carried several exceptionally large life insurance policies, one of which named his own law firm as a beneficiary. Barnaby mentioned that he was scheduled to meet with Mr. Dan Carson, the senior partner, later that afternoon. Claudia realized immediately that Barnaby was an investigator sent because the company wanted a thorough inquiry into the accident, given the massive size of the policy. She offered to show him the exact location in the backyard where the incident had occurred. As they walked out into the neatly manicured yard, Barnaby recalled the details from the police report. The authorities had concluded that Mr. Beecher came home, prepared a dish of food, and was accidentally attacked by the family dog. However, Claudia made it clear through her tone that she believed there was a dark truth hidden beneath the official report. She explained that the dog, Buck, had been perfectly trained by Laura's first husband and that Laura possessed a unique, powerful influence over the animal. Before she could elaborate, Laura herself appeared at the door, accompanied by a man named George Roswell. Laura's voice was cold as she interrupted, accusing Claudia of spreading lies, while Claudia fiercely replied that Joe's passing had left Laura an incredibly wealthy woman, something that would never have happened if Joe had gone through with the divorce he was planning. After Laura ordered Claudia to leave the property, George Roswell stepped forward to introduce himself to Barnaby, explaining that he had served in the Air Force with Laura's first husband, Ed. Barnaby, always polite, shared a piece of wisdom from an old preacher friend of his, comparing a complicated marriage to picking huckleberries in the summer, where the finest fruits are often surrounded by the sharpest thorns. Barnaby explained that the policy contained a double indemnity clause for accidental death, which raised a technical question regarding the exact nature of Buck's training. If the dog had received formal attack training, the insurance company would not be required to pay the double amount. Laura insisted that her late husband had only trained Buck for protection, not to be a killer, and that the dog had absolutely no history of biting anyone. When Barnaby asked to speak with young Colin, Laura informed him that the boy had spent the last 3 days at the animal shelter where the authorities were holding Buck. Barnaby drove down to the local animal shelter, the sound of barking dogs echoing through the concrete hallways. He found Colin sitting quietly outside a large cage, holding his head in his hands. Barnaby introduced himself gently, assuring the boy that he was not there to harm the dog. Colin was defensive, crying out that he would not let anyone destroy his best friend, insisting that Buck would never hurt anyone without a magnificent reason. Colin believed that his stepfather must have mistreated the dog to provoke such a reaction. A shelter attendant interrupted to tell Colin that his mother was on the telephone, and as the boy went to answer it, the attendant sadly informed Barnaby that an official order had just come down to destroy the dog at noon the following day. The attendant, who had grown fond of the animal, showed Barnaby how remarkably obedient Buck truly was. With simple, quiet commands, the dog moved perfectly, heeling and staying with absolute precision. For 3 consecutive years, Colin and Buck had won the grand trophy for the best obedience-trained dog in the region. Barnaby contemplated the situation deeply, wondering if it was truly possible to secretly retrain a naturally friendly, highly intelligent dog into a calculated instrument of harm. The shelter worker admitted that while it was highly unusual, a dog as brilliant as Buck could potentially be taught almost anything by a skilled handler. Meanwhile, at the prominent law offices downtown, Dan Carson was preparing his case files when Laura arrived. She was determined to find a new will that she believed Joe had been drafting, pleading with Dan to unseal the private files. Dan viewed her with a mixture of pity and skepticism, calling her a single-minded woman. Their conversation was paused when the secretary announced that Barnaby Jones had arrived for his scheduled meeting. Joining them in the office, Claudia Elwood renewed her bitter accusations, stating that Laura had a massive financial motive to prevent Joe from finalizing a divorce that would have cut both her and Colin out of his estate entirely. Dan tried to calm Claudia down, explaining to Barnaby that Joe had taken Claudia under his wing years ago, encouraging her to attend law school at night and helping her pass the bar exam, which explained why she took his passing so heavily. The tension escalated later that evening when Laura discovered Claudia inside Joe's old home office, searching through his personal desk. Laura accused her of breaking in like a common thief, while Claudia countered that she was looking for definitive proof of murder. Claudia pointed out that it was Laura's dog that had committed the act, and that no one else would know how to command the animal so perfectly. Seeking more clarity, Barnaby visited the home of Mary Wiley, a longtime neighbor of the family. Mary confirmed that Laura and Colin had arrived at her house for dinner at 5:45 on the night of the tragedy. She explained that Laura had married Joe hoping to provide stability for her son, but Colin had deeply resented his stepfather, leading to terrible arguments within the household. Mary's young son, Jimmy, mentioned to Barnaby that on the night of the incident, Colin had been incredibly angry about something and had left the house abruptly before dinner was even served, slipping away into the darkness. Furthermore, Mary revealed a piece of family history, explaining that Laura's first husband, Ed, had tragically drowned during a fishing trip years ago. A trip he had taken to cheer Colin up because the boy was devastated about not being allowed to bring Buck with them to a new overseas job assignment. Colin and Buck had miraculously survived that boating accident together. When Barnaby returned to speak with Laura, he found George Roswell by her side. Barnaby gently explained that he was trying to determine whether Buck had received formal attack training, but he was also growing increasingly concerned that the entire event might not have been an accident at all. George admitted that he had been secretly spending time with Laura that evening, and they had hidden the truth to avoid further wild accusations from Claudia Elwood. They lacked any outside witnesses to verify their whereabouts during the exact time of the event. Their conversation was suddenly interrupted by the news that Colin had broken into the animal shelter and escaped into the nearby hills with Buck. As a police helicopter began searching the dark hills with a massive searchlight, Barnaby received a vital update from his daughter-in-law, Betty Jones, who had been conducting background research. Betty discovered that George Roswell was facing severe financial ruin, and his architectural project had only been saved from bankruptcy the previous day because Laura had suddenly agreed to fund it using her inheritance. Betty also uncovered an extraordinary detail about Claudia Elwood's past. Her father had been a veterinarian in Idaho who owned a specialized kennel dedicated to breeding and training large security and attack dogs. Barnaby immediately went back to the law offices to speak with Claudia, but the building was mostly dark. He found her working late in Joe's old office. When Barnaby mentioned her family's background with attack dogs, Claudia realized the implication but remained steadfast, promising to call Barnaby the moment she discovered the hidden documents. Sadly, that call would never come. Later that night, a tragic event occurred at the office parking garage. A parking attendant reported hearing a woman screaming a single word repeatedly into the night air before everything went silent. The next morning, Lieutenant Biddle of the local police department met Barnaby at the scene. Claudia had been found deceased, bearing marks that strongly suggested an encounter with a powerful animal. The parking attendant noted that she had been screaming what sounded like the name Colin, or perhaps the word calling. Barnaby carefully examined the ground nearby and discovered a distinct set of animal prints in the dust, prints that belonged to a very large German Shepherd, but Barnaby noticed a minute detail that sets it apart. To find the runaway boy, Barnaby used a clever, compassionate trick. He visited young Jimmy Wiley and mentioned that the shelter had accidentally given Buck the wrong medicine, and without a specific antidote, the dog would surely perish within hours. The worried Jimmy immediately ran to the secret hiding spot in the old woods where Colin and Buck were sheltering. Barnaby followed quietly, finding the boys sharing a simple breakfast of pork and beans. Barnaby sat down with Colin, speaking to him with the respect due to a young man growing up, explaining that running away would never solve his troubles. He promised Colin that they could use scientific evidence to prove Buck's absolute innocence. Using specialized ink and lifting sheets from his car, Barnaby took a clear print of Buck's front paw. When he compared it to the prints found at the garage where Claudia had been attacked, the tracking details did not match at all. Buck possessed a small, distinct scar on his pad from his escape from the shelter cage, a mark completely absent from the garage prints. This definitive proof demonstrated that a totally different dog was involved in the crimes. Barnaby returned Colin and Buck to a relieved Laura. He explained to George Roswell and Laura that Joe Beecher, who was notoriously afraid of dogs, would only have approached an animal in the dark if he completely believed it was Buck. Barnaby then connected the final pieces of the puzzle with Betty's help. By contacting the Military Personnel Records Bureau, Barnaby discovered that George Roswell and Colin's biological father had both served as air police assigned to Strategic Air Command Base Security, where their primary duty was training and handling German Shepherds for military patrol work. Barnaby visited a specialized guard dog kennel in the Outer Valley, where the owner confirmed that a beautiful German Shepherd, a near-identical twin to Buck, had been purchased recently by someone connected to the case. Armed with this knowledge, Barnaby sent Betty to search the law office files one last time, while he confronted the true mastermind at the kennel site. Dan Carson arrived at the kennel, realizing his elaborate plan was falling apart. He had been operating a massive, fraudulent land development scheme that Joe Beecher had uncovered. Joe had amassed ironclad evidence of the swindle and was using it to confront Dan. To eliminate the threat, Dan, utilizing his own hidden knowledge of dog training and acquiring a look-alike animal, staged the initial event to look like a tragic accident caused by Buck. When Claudia grew close to discovering the blackmail documents hidden securely beneath a filing cabinet drawer, Dan used the trained animal to silence her, framing the young boy Colin by making it seem as though she was calling out his name in her final moments. The authorities arrived just in time to apprehend Dan Carson, thanks to a timely phone call from Betty. With the truth fully revealed, the dark cloud over the family completely vanished. Laura and George could look forward to an honest future, and young Colin held his beloved dog close, knowing they were finally safe. As they drove home, Betty looked at Barnaby with admiration, asking how he had known from the very beginning that the loyal family dog was entirely innocent. Barnaby smiled gently, looking out at the beautiful California coastline, and remarked that believing in the unwavering loyalty of a devoted companion was always the easiest part of any journey.